Jeff is a Mi'kmaq filmmaker from Quebec. His short films have played in numerous festivals, including Sundance, Tribeca, Fantasia, and Vancouver. And I'll put in a little personal anecdote. I was on a film jury at the Whistler Film Festival where we gave his film Colony the Best Short Film Prize. His film, The Colony, was selected by the festival as one of Canada's top 10 shorts in 2007. His debut feature, Rhymes for Young Ghouls, won Best First Feature at the Vancouver International Film Festival, screened at TIFF, and is obviously selected as part of Canada's top 10 for 2013. Earlier this week at the Toronto Film Critics Week, Norman Jewison won an award called the Technicolor Clyde Gilmore Award, and the way that award works is you pay it forward and you give the award to an emerging younger filmmaker, and this year Jewison gave it to Jeff. So it's $50,000 in production funding that will go towards his next film. So next to Jeff is... And actually, maybe I'll mention now, Jeff's got that upcoming screening still of Rhymes for Young Ghouls on Saturday. Is that right? Yeah, but there's also the release date for his film is going to be January 31st. So for those of you that can't make the Saturday screening, you can go and see the film in a regular theater where we should all be going to support and see Canadian films. So next to Jeff is Alan Zweig, who was born and educated in Toronto. After working in the film industry as a writer, director, producer, actor for 25 years, he found his niche directing documentaries. His films include Vinyl, Family Secrets, I Curmudgeon, although I think he's less curmudgeonly these days, Lovable, and A Hard Name, which won the Genie Award for Best Documentary. This year, he's been particularly busy, releasing both 15 Reasons to Live and When Jews Were Funny, the latter of which won the City of Toronto and Canada Goose Award for Best Canadian Feature Film at the Toronto International Film Festival. Also recently, Alan was selected as one of the top 10 one of the top 10 heroes of Canadian cinema for 2013 by Greg Klimke, who writes a fantastic film blog called Film Corner. Alan? And finally, we have stepping in for Luc Dury. Very valiantly, Steve has decided to step forward. So Steve Gravestock, who is a senior programmer here at the Toronto International Film Festival and works year-round at TIFF Bell Lightbox. He's a senior programmer at the festival, but then responsible for a lot of the Canadian programming that happens at Lightbox year-round. And also we worked formally together as programmers together, so on a personal note, a swell guy. So thanks for stepping in, Steve. All right. So at this point, I'm going to invite Jeff to come up and kick off the sort of preliminary discussions of what makes the C word, what makes a film Canadian.
I'm a little mad at Luke for not showing up since I'm sick too. I'm going to try to keep this brief. It was an interesting invite from Steve when he asked me to come in and talk about Canadian film, because I don't identify with what I perceive to be Canadian aspects in film. I remember when we won an award at a big festival in the U.S., the Tribeca Film Festival, and we had this really harsh indictment. And one of the jury members said it was so nice to see a screenplay that came out of Canada that wasn't so Canadian. I'm not 100% sure what he meant by it to this day. I think he kind of implied that Canadian films were boring, and they seem to kind of preoccupy themselves with an internal landscape or a very external one. And I come from a pretty bizarre position in that I am both a Canadian filmmaker and a Quebec filmmaker, yet I don't identify with either. And I think there's a definite legacy of First Nations filmmakers, particularly in the past 20, 30 years, that you can sit there and see cultural identifiers to being both Canadian and both First Nations, but they come from a definitive outsider perspective, and I feel like that is where I stand in both genres, frankly, in both First Nation cinema and in Canadian cinema. Given the respective histories of the two groups of peoples, Canadians and First Nations, there's an almost from a First Nations perspective, there's almost an unwritten rule that your films have to be positive. I've always taken umbrage with this because there's this idea that if you promote Native people as positive images, you're somehow doing justice to the culture, or you're providing a positive, well, frankly, stereotype. You're providing a positive stereotype in which young Native youth can follow. But growing up on a reserve, I've always looked at Native cinema coming out of Canada, or Native television shows, the North of 60s, the Beachcombers, things like that, and I couldn't identify with them because they weren't made by Native people, and I think that was one of the first reasons I decided to get into filmmaking. One of the first Native films that I seen was a movie called Incident at Restigouche, and it was incidentally about my reserve, and it was made by Alan Isabamswin. And from a very early stage, I began to look at. I began to identify cinema with protest because of that film, and because of the kind of violent imagery in it, and the kind of overt suppression of Canadians and First Nations identity and First Nations sovereignty. So when I started making films, one of the things that I wanted to do was depict Native people as I experienced them, as I seen them, and it's kind of bizarre because while the Canadian industry has somewhat embraced me, I find the First Nations film industry has somewhat kind of pushed me away, specifically because I don't make that positive image of what Native people are supposed to be. And that's something I truly do not understand to this day. Not why they don't include me, but why being a Native person growing up in Canada, being a Native person that grew up on a reserve, my opinion of Native people isn't considered valid. So I think what I try to do with my films is present an authentic and definitive idea of where I come from, and not really represent First Nations as a whole or any kind of pan-Indianism, but to represent Micmac and Lestage specifically. So when I think about what defines Canadian cinema, I come up with a bit of a blank because I don't 100% know what defines Canada. I do not understand why Canadians do the things that they do. I don't understand why we elect a prime minister like Harper. I do not understand why we allow him to do the things that he does. And I do not understand why Native people have never been given a voice in politics or really any kind of public platform. And I think by virtue of these exclusions, we're defining Canada, or a kind of seedy underbelly of Canada that nobody really wants to acknowledge. And if you look at something like the reaction to another one of Alanice's films, the one about the incident at the Whiskey Trench and the 2000. Well, what was the name of the film? I can't believe Rosket. No, but there was one before that. There was the Kanesatake one. I remember taking that in a Canadian cinemas class while I was still in film school, and we were talking about the reaction to it, and I think Canadians didn't expect to see such vitriol and hatred and racism so kind of vehemently thrown at these Native people. And I think there's kind of like a collective consciousness out there that really believes the kind of jokes coming out of the West, and that Canadians are all nice and they're all polite and they're all very soft-spoken. That has not been my experience growing up as a Native person. So I think when we kind of got that indictment from Tribeca that our film wasn't Canadian, I think that's what they meant, that they didn't expect to see such violence in my films. They didn't expect to see such intensity and kind of such hatred directed at the characters, the First Nations characters. And really, that's been my experience with Canada. And it's strange to think of something like an omission as being a kind of a type of racism directed at the Native people, but that's kind of what it is. And the strange thing for me is that you're seeing like a lack of empathy on both sides, in that both Native cinema and non-Native cinema, and when I say non-Native cinema, I mean anything about Indians that really isn't directed by a Native person, kind of dancing in this light of positivity. I think it partially has to do with trying to maintain that identity of Canadians being nice, when we should really be focusing on all the things that we've been ignoring for the past few centuries, frankly. And I think when we did Rhymes, I think that was partially because we wanted to bring a part of Canadian history in residential schools to the fore, and to have it as a part of the national identity, and have it in a kind of definitive discussion as a part of Canadian history, and a kind of legacy that you do not walk off or rub dirt on, and have it acknowledged, and have the victims of these schools acknowledged, and this mutually accepted ignorance as a part of history, to put it behind us and to move forward. And I, to this day, do not know how to define Canadian cinema, because I do not understand it, even though I'm a part of it. I do not know how to define Quebec cinema, despite the fact that I've lived there my entire life, because we're really not a part of it. I don't really feel like I'm a part of it outside of the kind of technical side. And I think you can kind of make that argument. I'm hoping somebody else here will make the argument about regional cinema, about Quebec cinema being kind of European, about the cinema out west being a little bit more polished, or East Coast cinema in general being a little bit more gritty. But I'm not the person to speak about that, because I feel like I've been more or less predefined by Canadian identity that I take no part in. If that makes any sense. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on Canadian cinema. Thank you.
When this question came up, or I was invited to be on the panel, I went immediately to one question, which is, do I concern myself with what is Canadian cinema? Do I think about it? Do I think about it when I see films? Do I think about it when I make films? No. But do I think that other people concern themselves with what's Canadian cinema? Yes, I do. And I think particularly of what I would call loosely gatekeepers of Canadian culture, meaning, government film agencies or publishers or broadcasters or anything. Yes, I have felt my whole life like there is a definition of Canadian cinema, whether it's written down or de facto. And so now let me tell you basically my life story. I guess this is the one place in Toronto that I don't have to actually tell you I'm Jewish. And we're not as funny as we used to be, if you haven't heard. But anyway, I was told by my father in explicit terms, not implicit at all, we're outsiders. We'll always be outsiders. We assimilate or we pretend to assimilate, but we never really assimilate. We're always separate. So that's what I felt up until the time sort of that I was a teenager. Because then other cultures, other interests started coming in. The first thing that actually was really important to me was the American civil rights struggle. Because my father told me that since we'd suffered racism, we should be especially sensitive to other people who suffered racism. So I was. I was 10 years old and I was reading books, autobiographies by black people. I read Bill Russell's autobiography. I read Dick Gregory's autobiography. I was totally identified with black civil rights leaders. Then the next thing that came, and it was a thing that basically affected me for the rest of my life, including now, was rock and roll. Like rock and roll and music, and then, like a lot of, rebellion, rock and roll, and then, then there was, I got this sort of from stand-up comedians, but also from writers, this whole idea of telling your story, expressing yourself, expressing your emotions, being outward with your emotions, So these started to be like who I was. I wasn't really thinking about Canada, but then it was 1967, and it was the centennial, and it was Expo 67, and my family went, and then Trudeau was elected, and somewhere in there we got the flag, and I did start to sort of think, okay, what is Canadian culture, and do I relate to it at all? And then when I was in grade 12, our English teacher said to us, we only study great literature, and therefore we're not studying any Canadian books, because there is no great Canadian literature except one book. Now, if she had then said that book is The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, I think my whole life would have been different, but she said, the book was called, and I don't want, I doubt any of you have heard of it, it's called As for Me and My House. It's written by Sinclair Ross in 1941. I had to Google it last night just to make sure I did remember it, and it's about, it said in Google, the experience of a Protestant minister and his wife and the struggles and hardships in the prairies of Canada. And, so, actually, as I read about it now, in retrospect, there might have been some interesting things about it if I'd cared. It's a diary. It's written as a diary, which I relate to. It's written in the voice of the wife, which is actually interesting. They were both failed artists, and they actually hated these small towns that the minister kept being put in, and they were longing to get back to the city. But at 16, those subtleties were lost on me. It was a book about a Protestant minister in the prairies, and it was really cold. Like, there was a lot of stuff about the weather. And it had nothing to do with my life. And it was like I've never been as oppressed by a piece of art or something as I was. Just like opening the book was just like, made me cold, and it's like, and I did. From that moment, I started to wonder whether that would ever change. Whether, what I related to, which was more urban and more expressive and maybe a little more Jewish and maybe a little more rock and roll and a little more rebellious and a little more whatever, would ever be reflected in Canadian. Now, this became more relevant when I started to try to make fiction films, and I started to get the money from the government film agencies. And I had some success getting development, but I never got production money. I never made it to the next level. And, there might have been other reasons why I failed at that have to do with my own lack of talent or lack of whatever. But, I felt like, and I still feel like, that there were implicit and explicit messages. Like, if you were like me, if you were, for instance, maybe influenced by American independent cinema of the 70s, Five Easy Pieces, et cetera, you're in the wrong place. If you were influenced by Woody Allen and Paul Mazursky and you wanted to make sort of urban romantic comedies like Annie Hall or An Unmarried Woman, go to the States. If you liked Scorsese or Peckinpah or Altman, you wanted to make Mean Streets or Taxi Driver or Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, you're in the wrong country. You know? It wasn't just stories that weren't Canadian, it was whole genres. It was just like, call me paranoid, but you ask anybody who was around there. Like, romantic comedies? No, we don't do them. You know, influenced by, so what do we make? That was hard to say. But like one thing we made, a lot of art films. I don't know why art films are Canadian. I often thought they were Canadian because they were inherently uncommercial and somebody wanted us to make uncommercial films. And again, that sounds conspiratorial, but I don't think so. Actually, at a certain point, immigrant stories became very Canadian, but Jewish, our immigrantness was lapsed. So, and then there were just things that were Canadian stories. I don't know. There was just something about them that was Canadian. And it made me second guess myself. I mean, that's really why I failed, because I just kept trying to guess how I could make what I liked a little more like what they liked. And I never could. I never did, So, and then I gave up. And I got this Arts Council money, and it was for a fiction film. And I was like, no, I'm not going to make a fiction film. So I made a documentary. And because it was Arts Council money, I was making a documentary, and I'd never made a documentary. I did exactly what I wanted to do. I completely reflected myself fully. It was about music, and it was about, me and being, single and childless, and my dog, and everything. Mice in my apartment. I just put it all in there, and I didn't really care. And then that film was like a hit and successful, and I had a career, and this invitation to you can make documentaries. So I switched to making documentaries where, I felt in a way like I was hiding out there, but it never came up again. Nobody ever told me that my films were not what we do. It's like, and maybe sometimes I thought it's because documentary is so inherently a Canadian genre that within that you can do anything you want. And that may be true. So, I do think that there have been dozens of films made in the last 20 years that do not fit into the definition, into the sort of as for me in my house paradigm that I think is still there. There are many people, Jeff and David Cronenberg, et cetera, that aren't. But, I'm strongly considering trying to make fiction films again. And I do feel like the shadow of that officially Canadian story is still out there. I still feel it. And, the other day, as I was getting ready to do this, I turned on the TV and saw this movie. I didn't know what it was, but first I saw there was snow, and then there were mountains, and then the story was developing that someone had gone for a hike, and maybe he was lost. People had to go look for him in the mountains, and then I started seeing names on credits of Canadians, perfectly talented people who I knew, and it was like, oh, I've seen this movie. I don't need to see this movie again. They're still making that movie. So that's there's what's Canadian for me? Anything made by Canadian. Anything made by predominantly Canadian. If I went to the Canadian Screen Awards and the new James Cameron film was up for an award, I'd say that's bullshit. But other than that, if the director's Canadian, if he or she still lives here, if they live in Quebec, if they're, et cetera, to me it's a Canadian film. But I don't think that is what other people, I'll say, those people think.
I'm going to actually talk about two different subjects. I'm going to talk about what defines a Canadian film from the perspective of a gatekeeper or a programmer at TIFF, and somebody who's worked on Canada's top 10 for a number of years, and how we define those, how we define a film as Canadian, why we came to those definitions, and then I'm going to talk a bit about a bit of the history about how those definitions developed in regions, and it'll probably be a bit more of a bit more of a stew than what I'm going to talk about initially. So anyway, basically, in terms of TIFF, we define a Canadian film as directed by a Canadian citizen or resident. And it should have some level of Canadian financing. It doesn't have to be entirely financed through Canadian means. Usually that means government money, frequently, telefilm, council monies, provincial agencies, provincial tax credits, that kind of stuff. Although including those things doesn't necessarily, not having those things doesn't mean we wouldn't count them as Canadian. Frequently I get a call from young filmmakers when they're submitting their film and they're like, so I made this movie, it's set, wherever, we have no telefilm money, does that matter to you? Will you still take the movie? And it's like, yes, we'll still take the movie. Funding has, it's just Canadian money. It doesn't have to be from a specific source. A lot of these reasons are designed. The reason why we define as a citizen or resident is it's sort of basically designed to eliminate, in some ways, service productions, which are productions that are made. They're essentially American films that are shot here. Either it used to be because of the cheaper dollar. There were a variety of reasons. Sometimes the landscape, etc. Often the director will come in. The director's not Canadian. They will be dropped in. They'll be in Canada for about 6 or 7 months, and then immediately hie back to the States or wherever. That in itself is not a very Canadian production. Often these films will be they'll be part of a long-running series. I don't want to pick on Resident Evil, but that's the obvious example. It's a very successful series. And frequently, when you look at awards shows and when they give awards for Canadian films, those films are often included because they are financed through Canadian means, and they always use Canadian crews. Obviously, but there's nothing particular to Canada, and almost always the director is not Canadian. So that was kind of, I guess, an intervention. It wasn't just a sort of bland definition that we used or a bland category that we used. When you the way it's done with most awards organizations, they use a kind of point system. You have to get a certain amount of points. You get a point for the director being Canadian, a point for the writer being Canadian, and it goes on down the list. That in itself can become very problematic, especially if you look at some of the history of what's gone on with the Genies. A couple years ago, there was every winner in the acting category there were no Canadian actors who actually won a major acting prize, and that's when you open it up that wide, it becomes deeply problematic, and can lead to those kind of situations. One of the notable things about how TIFF and through Canada's Top 10 we define Canadian stuff is that it doesn't include content. You don't have to have shot the film in Canada. You don't have to have like shots of the CN Tower or any recognizable Canadian geography. And the reason for that, there's a variety of reasons for that. One is obviously we're living in an increasingly global world, and you'd be hampering what the artists could talk about. That in itself would also, limit the scope of the film and where it would reach out to. Artists should be able to, talk about whatever they like, address any subject they like. Secondly, we live in a very multicultural country, an increasingly multicultural world. And for many Canadian filmmakers, events that happened outside of Canada, really not even involving Canada at all until, for example, like partition. Partition is a the partition of India and the British the British departure from India eventually led to a large-scale immigration by Indians to Canada, so creating a very large Indo-Canadian community. And partition is a central event in many Canadians' lives. That's why they're here. It changed their family dynamic, etc. And that often goes through a wide variety of different ethnic groups, or a lot of different ethnic groups have had a similar type of experience. So to not include that different ethnic background, we might as well be just telling you guys to go out and read Sinclair Ross, which I also had to suffer through Sinclair Ross in a variety of university and high school courses. And unlike Alan, I didn't actually read As For Me in My House. I read the short stories, but often when you opened a Sinclair Ross book, you could smell the mold on the paper, even when you just bought it, because they're very much 40s. Of a 30s or 40s view of what Canada was. And thankfully, I think I went to school a little later, so we actually had Margaret Atwood, and so I didn't have to, just to address Sinclair Ross's work. But in terms of, there are many Canadian films that deal with different cultural backgrounds, visits, assessments of heritage, involvement with heritage. Deepa's films are an obvious example. A film like Water. Also Incendies, the Denis Villeneuve film. Modra, Ingrid Veninger's film, which is set largely in Bratislava. Rubenata's last film, which is set in Egypt. Very different cultural background. I think that's very much reflected in the films. One of the issues about having a broad definition is that actually not so much having a broad definition, but this is the murky part where I'm going to kind of feel my way through the talk, but I'll be quick. One of the issues about having a loose definition is that and being next door to essentially an industrial powerhouse. I mean, when people think about films, they often automatically think about American stars, American movies, American genres, or genres that were most notably exploited by Americans, or frankly, they were exported everywhere. So that's usually why people think those genres like westerns. Many countries have those kind of, if not westerns, genres that would readily apply to their culture but are generally seen as American. For example, romantic comedies, which, as Alan said, that wasn't something Canadian producers would do early on, or 20 or 30 years ago. But now, of course, we do a significant amount more. But I remember writing an article about Canadian romantic comedy about 15 years ago, and I found 10. And the editor was extremely proud of me for finding 10. And they were good movies, but anyway. One of the problems with the being next door to this kind of powerhouse is that you often get into this. The assumption is, if you identify your film as Canadian, that people will be less interested, and that you will have a more difficult time selling the film internationally. That you will have and frankly, this has been proven basically by observation. Often, it's much tougher for a Canadian film within Canada to find an audience for a long list of reasons. But I think this one of the issues about urging people or people not wanting being identified as Canadian, it turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't identify yourself as Canadian and people like your film, then you've done very little for the cinema, for that national cinema. There was many years ago, or well, not that many, I'm dating myself repeatedly. About 10 years ago, we were interviewing somebody to intern in the Canadian film department here at TIFF, in the programming department. We asked the person, and usually we end, this is a tip if you ever apply for a job here, usually the last question is, what's the last Canadian film you saw in a theater? And some people know right away. They have an immediate answer. This candidate kind of stared off into space briefly, and then said, "Can I mention something that was on television?" And we were like, "Sure, no problem," because we didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable. And they mentioned Denny Arcon's Barbarian Invasions, which they'd just seen on television. And so the follow-up question, again, just as a tip, was, what was the last film you liked? And they said, "Oh, I saw this really cool movie about a DJ in Ibiza. It's called It's All Gone Pete Tong. It was awesome." And we informed her that was actually a Canadian film. It was done by Mike Dowse. And of course, it had no recognizable Canadian signifiers in it. It was all set in Ibiza. The DJ was British, except for the fact that Mike Dowse was a fairly well-known filmmaker at the time. But anyway, but that is what happens when you opt not to define yourself. And frequently, it's usually the most galling thing you have to do as a programmer is when people start blanching at the notion of being identified as Canadian for a variety of reasons. And some of them are, they're business reasons and they're kind of valid, but looking at them can be valid in some ways. But looking at it culturally, it's deeply problematic, and you're essentially giving up the ghost if you don't want to be identified as Canadian. One of the so not surprisingly, when they applied for grants through Canadian agencies, they were quite happy to be identified as Canadian. There was no complaints about that. And often this will lead a lot, over the years I've had a lot of confusion about Canadian identification. There was often in terms of co-production, there was a co-production about a very famous international figure. I think there was German money in it, French money, and Canadian money. The director was Canadian. And we opted to program the film, and I called one of the producers, and the producer begged me not to include it in the Canadian section, and that the film was an international film, that it didn't deal with an obvious Canadian subject, and they felt that being identified as Canadian and being put in a section we used to call as Perspective Canada would be disadvantageous to the film's commercial success, not commercial success, not necessarily critical success. And so, of course, we said, that's fine. We'll put it in an international section. Those arguments make sense. It's a co-production, so we had a little bit of leeway. And unfortunately, the producer did not inform the director that they were no longer eligible for the Canadian Film Prize, which was a large cash prize, and they were extremely upset about it. So that is often what happens when you have these sort of conflicting views, which often arise when you're dealing with international co-productions. If I could pick up a bit on the service production aspects and not being identified as Canadian, what's happened, particularly in some of the regions in Canada, is that because the provinces or the provincial bodies have opted to focus primarily on bringing in service productions, which is almost largely American productions. As a result, the local industry has suffered. In fact, I would say the glaring example is British Columbia, which has, I would say, per capita, it has an extremely talented pool of filmmakers, young filmmakers, older filmmakers, veteran filmmakers. They have some very good film schools there, so there are people entering that area quite. On an annual basis. But the emphasis has largely been on that runaway production stuff, TV series, American films. So as a result, the local artists have not been well funded. There is no real provincial body to fund those films because the emphasis has been on bringing in American productions that will bring in American money and pay Canadian crews. But as a result, many BC filmmakers are either leaving British Columbia. They often work here on television or on films, or the filmmakers have basically resorted to self-financing. Which is, that means they get the films made, but it often means that their vision itself is restricted because they're restricted to what they can raise on their own. There's a number of veteran filmmakers who've won major prizes at film festivals who, as a result of this sort of short-sightedness, both in terms of provincial policy, but in general. I mean, often I know in Toronto when the production sort of dropped, there was a lot of concern, and it is a lot of money coming in, but still, if you're not going to identify yourself as Canadian and you're not going to pursue that, you're essentially giving up the ghost, and that's it. Yeah. Are you going to cut me off? Good. Thanks.
Okay. Is this on? Yes. Yes? Yes. There we go. Okay. I wanted to start by asking if any of the panelists have questions for each other. Was there anything that when the other two were talking, you were like, I need to challenge them on that, or I need to ask them about that, or yes, no?
I was actually going to jump in about the regional stuff, because I think Jeff's right. There's one of the things about coming up with the definition of Canadian cinema is that it's defined by region plays a large role in it. Right. But regions played a large role in everything that's happened in the country, right? I mean, regionalism is frequently, it's discussed, and it's often politically advantageous to the powers that be in terms of politics and, splitting things up. The debate between Quebec and the rest of the country, the whole separatism issue, it's often hugely beneficial to specific political interests.
Okay, but are you saying, because I didn't understand when Jeff said it, are you saying that there are regional differences in Canada just because people from Ontario make different films inherently being from Ontario? Are you saying there's regional differences because the regional telefilm office in Toronto funds different films than than SODEC in Quebec? Because I'm just for me, I'm saying, like, it's ridiculous for me to think that the kinds of stories that people want to tell would be identifiable as Torontonian or Western or something. Like, I can't do that for American filmmakers. I don't know how you could. No, I mean, people have differences. People tell different stories. I don't know where, I don't think the Coen brothers, yes, some of their stories happen to be set in Minnesota, but I don't think of them as Minnesota filmmakers. I don't think, to me, it's like, I see myself as a filmmaker in the world, and I relate to some filmmakers in the world, and I don't relate to some others, and it has nothing to do with Canada or anything, and it seems hard to believe that, for me, that anybody can really, put you in your place like that.
I know I wouldn't be the same filmmaker if I didn't grow up in Quebec on a reserve. That is 100%. Like, I can't.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't be. I know, but I'm just saying, like, so does everybody who grew up in a reserve in Quebec make the same kind of films?
Well, there's only one of us so far, so I can't really speak to that.
Well, whatever, I grew up in Forest Hill in Toronto, and so did David Cronenberg, and he's only a few years older than me, and we make completely different films.
I think in terms of the regional aspect, I think that there's differences in terms of funding. Obviously, there's different, just the physical aspects of where you're shooting. It's different to shoot in Vancouver than it is in Toronto. For one thing, it's, the backdrop in Vancouver is a lot more beautiful. And I think that...
Can I jump in, Steve?
Sure.
Canada has actually promoted a type of regional filmmaking by having regional offices, like having regional offices of telefilm, of the NFB. If you think about the American model, if you want to make films, you go to New York maybe, but most likely you'll go to Los Angeles, right? You go to where they make films. And then people will go off and they'll shoot in Minnesota, or they'll shoot in whatever, but there's no incentive or there's no push to go have the Minnesota Film Office and try to set up an industry. We have a model where we try to create industries in almost every major city in the country. So Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Halifax to agree, Edmonton, we have regional offices so it does breed a certain regionalism. I think that's partially the way that I'm interpreting regionalism. I don't know if it's the same way that Jeff is.
I think so too, and I know for a fact that you can always tell a film that's coming out of Quebec, and it's not always identifiable by it being French. I think there's a kind of distinct visual style coming out of Quebec that kind of lends itself a little bit more to a European vibe than, say, something coming out of Toronto or Vancouver. There's
Okay, but if that's true, I think it had nothing to do with the filmmakers. It has to do with the filmmakers trying to reach a standard that's been imposed on them, and they want to continue to get funding, so that's what I feel. I don't think that, otherwise, really, it doesn't make sense to me that everybody from Quebec would be,
They're not, but if we go back to the point that you made, Alan, that you were saying that you felt like you needed to sort of mold what you wanted to do to fit the model to get the money. And I think what we get is because we have all these regional offices that might have slightly distinctive takes on it, people are pitching those projects to those offices, to those tastes, to those demands. So whether it be, if it's a BC-based film and they're like, okay, I'm going to have to shoot in Stanley Park or show what's the Lion Bridge, whatever that one's called.
That big bridge.
That big bridge, yeah. And that.
Thank
you.
I'm just going to, I couldn't really fit this into my talk, but I'm just going to introduce one sort of interesting wrinkle into this subject, which is that when the Jewish Film Festival first came to Toronto, and there first started being Jewish film festivals, I was kind of like, oh, why do you have to do it? Like, I really didn't like that they had them. I didn't like that they existed. I was just kind of like, we don't need that. But, after a while, it just was. I had to accept it. And I started to think, well, I'm Jewish. Like, how come you don't invite my films to be in the Jewish, like I made this film, I Curmudgeon. I wouldn't call it a Jewish film, but in retrospect, it's a pretty Jewish film. So, and then, of course, the answer to that is that according to the Jewish Film Festival, if Jeff makes a film about, Israel, it'll get in. But if I make a film about natives, it won't get in. Because Jewish Film Festival means Jewish subject. They don't care who made it. Whereas, Canadian, so it's kind of interesting, like, does that actually also apply to Canadian? Like, is it Canadian if the subject is Canadian, or is it Canadian simply on the basis of the nationality? Now, in terms of documentary, I think it's a lot more open because my film is, barely Canadian by any definition. Like, we shot it in New York, LA. There are a few Canadians in it, but it's about being Jewish, not about being Jewish Canadian. Anyway, I just throw that in there.
I had a couple of questions that came up when you guys were speaking, so I wanted to get to them. And Jeff, I'm going to start with you. I was really intrigued that, with your talk about not identifying with being Canadian, and that completely makes sense given your context. And then I was thinking about influences. I was thinking about the relationship between documentary and fiction. So Alan, you talking about starting out with fiction, then moving into documentary, and one of my questions was whether you wanted to move back into fiction, and you answered that towards the end. But Jeff, I guess it's a question of sort of influences in terms of if you're not I got this impression that you weren't necessarily seeing the kind of filmmaking that you wanted to do in Canadian models, except for maybe Cronenberg, right, in genre filmmaking and a more commercial filmmaking. And then you mentioned the Elenisa Bomsawin documentary, which I thought was interesting, that then had this impact on you. So can you talk about influences? I mean, it's interesting that she's a documentary filmmaker, and she can make the kind of documentaries and sort of make the statement that she wants to make, and that gets a lot of attention, whereas you seem to be trying to make a similar point in a fiction mode, and people don't seem to want to hear it delivered in that way. Like, if you made a documentary.
I've always wondered, it's like a 20-hour conversation.
Make it a 2-minute answer.
I've always been influenced by Canadian films to a certain extent, and it's weird that Steve told that story because I kind of have I have a bunch of similar stories like that where, I didn't even know Cronenberg was Canadian until I was like 25 or something like that. I was actually surprised to find that his films had come out of Canada, even though looking back at it retrospectively, that they're does seem to be very Canadian elements to it, but a huge influence for me too used to be this this television station called First Choice. I don't know if anybody remembers First Choice. It turned into TMN, and anyway, First Choice used to show a lot of really obscure Canadian films. So I grew up watching really kind of obscure Canadian films. That's the first time I seen Lilo, and the first time I seen Villeneuve's first picture. I don't know why.
32nd August on Earth.
Yeah, and so I started noticing like a distinct visual style coming out of Quebec. Once I started to kind of notice that there was a kind of similarity between all these films, but for me, a lot of my influences come out of literature and come out of art, and none of those are Canadian. A lot of them are European, old European. For some reason, I have a fascination with old Europe, and I kind of want to know why those people had a fascination with Canada and with Native people in general that still exists. I mean, if you look at Berlin's film festival, they have a kind of distinct Native adjunct, which I never get into for whatever reason. And I think influences are really the people in my life, and it's so hard to kind of identify as Canadian, or not necessarily identify as Canadian, but to not identify as Canadian because we live in Canada. Our history, our Native people's history, is so ingrained with Canadians' history that it's hard to sit there and say, yeah, I don't feel Canadian at all. But my reserve is an hour away from Maine. My family would always migrate to Maine because there was no work, and we grew up kind of traveling across the border back and forth to Maine, so there was really no regional or kind of distinct borders for us. And a lot of people don't know this, but Native people hold dual citizenship. So the majority of my family actually went to the U.S. to put up steel, or to pick potatoes, or to join the Marines, or to find other opportunities that, for whatever reason, weren't in Canada. So I have a kind of really weird background in that I didn't even know how to define Canadians in general, because I frankly do not understand them. I just do not understand the thought processes behind a lot of what Canada does, because it seems so counterintuitive to building a country that's good for everybody, opposed to just good for non-native people or I don't even know what the end process is. So influences for me, I mean, I count Cameron as an influence. So does that mean it's Canadian? But Steve kind of mentioned that he wouldn't quantify as a Canadian director. But when I look at something like whatever that Pandora movie was called, anybody? The Smurfs. Avatar. Avatar is a distinctly Native story, and this guy grew up in Ontario. So does that mean that he used that kind of conflict that was going around? And there was conflict. There's definitive conflict between Cornwall and Ontario and that whole region between the U.S. and that reserve that's on the U.S. side and the Canadian side. There's always been conflict there, so he would have known about that unless he was an ostrich with his head in the sand. So does that mean that he eventually kind of turned that into Avatar? I mean, who's to know? I mean, that is definitively Canadian conflict right there, and it's still going on.
I guess that he had his head in the sand. Because I did. I mean, I'm basically the same age as him, and he grew up in Niagara Falls. I don't think he was aware of natives in Niagara Falls particularly, and I wasn't in Toronto.
Some people actually think he ripped the whole story off from Fern Gully.
Yeah, that's true.
They may have. I don't know if the screenwriter was Canadian for that.
So, Alan, do you feel that you could make a fiction film that you would like at this point, and make it in the way that you want?
No. Actually, somebody
not?
the other day at the cocktail party said something really nice to me, which made me feel really good. They said, you've earned a right to fail at fiction. So,
So,
so I think I will try, and if I fail,
the failure is built in, though.
if I fail, I'll come back to documentary with my tail between my legs.
Margaret Atwood called that very Canadian, actually.
Yeah. See, this is a part this is the part about this that really bothers me, I have to say. For a filmmaker, the question of whether your film is Canadian is something you really should get out of your head. This is not something that we should be, Jeff and I should not be discussing this at all. This is for Liz and Steve and professors and writers. And it's like what this horrible thing is true, any filmmaker can tell you, which is that when you apply for a grant or write a proposal or something, you have to pretend that you are the critic of your own film, writing about the film after the fact that it's made. They ask you about what's your theme and what's your undercurrent and what's your subtext. It's like, that is not our job to have themes or subtext. Our job is to make the film, and your job is to interpret it in any way you want. So when Steve even says, whatever, even when Jeff says something very Canadian, or afterwards I found out that Cronenberg was Canadian and I saw stuff that's very Canadian, I don't believe that. Like, I just don't think, yes, by the way, I drove on Videodrome, so. But, I remember the locations that we shot, and, the first one was at the Factory Theater at Richmond and Bathurst, and then we shot at on a house on Crawford Street and whatever, but no, I don't think there's anything distinctly Canadian about Cronenberg. I think he's a filmmaker who was influenced by many things, so that here's what they say about Canadian: we're outsiders. It's like, I'm Jewish, I'm already outsider. Now I'm Canadian, I'm an outsider. It's like, artists are outsiders, period. You don't have to be Canadian. So if that makes you Canadian, then every artist in the world's Canadian. So like it's an interesting thing to talk about, but it really isn't something I concern myself with, except for the fact that when I apply, if I'm gonna make a film that's influenced by film noir or by Taxi Driver, or if Taxi Driver was my favorite film, well, I better not show that influence.
It's actually interesting. You're going to find this out when you venture into the fiction world. You get penalized if you start using non-Canadian actors, or if you start using non-Canadian craftsmen. So there's a kind of distinctive push out there to make sure that your content is Canadian. But like I said, I'm not 100% sure how to define that. Like, I don't even consider myself a Quebec filmmaker, or actually I do. I consider myself a Quebec filmmaker. I do consider myself a Canadian filmmaker, but I do not consider the content of my films Canadian per se, which is kind of absurd because the residential school system, which is a huge theme in Rhymes, is a kind of distinctly Canadian problem, but the way it's handled in the film is kind of, you'd probably liken it to more like Patrick Swayze movies like Roadhouse and kind of like Conan the Barbarian and stuff like that. It has a very action-oriented, very kind of revenge-oriented theme, so I can't even think of another Canadian film that is kind of revolves around getting revenge and kind of murdering your oppressor and things like that, because it's so nice. I mean, why would a Canadian want to kill anybody? But then you see stuff like Robert Picton out in Vancouver. You start hearing stories about hundreds of Native women disappearing. So there's a definitive violent undertone to Canadian society, particularly directed towards Native people. So I grew up looking at Canada way different than you guys did. That's for sure.
So how did a film like Rhymes get made? Because you're not telling that it is a revenge.
Because we're in Quebec, frankly.
Yeah?
Yeah, because we're in Quebec. Because Le Sedec doesn't give a damn about, whether or not your film has Canadian content. They care whether or not it's good. I mean, it needs to be good.
The thing that keeps rippling through this conversation is genre, right? And Quebec actually does have a very robust genre filmmaking tradition. But so does English Canada. I mean, the tax shelter years, there was lots of genre films being made.
Yeah, but that ended. I mean,
It did end. It did end,
Those
but-
films are generally laughed at, but really, they're sure.
But there's- but Cronenberg
there's a
came
lot.
out of that
But
era.
really, those films are, in retrospect, better than a lot of what happened. The Silent Partner or something like that. Those are still good films, but no. Once telefilm got involved and all that, films like that didn't get made anymore. Middle Age Crazy or the films like that. That never would have been. And I'm not saying they were all good. There were some horrible ones, but there were some good. I guess it's not. I'm not even going to argue that they were good. I'm just going to say that if we'd continued to make films like that, we would have a film industry.
But there were some good films. I mean, Cronenberg came out of the tax shelter years, that era.
Yeah, but I mean,
Well,
Cronenberg.
good films,
and
but-
there is an industry. It's just the industry doesn't necessarily include directors.
Yeah.
In that way, it includes like crews and things
Yeah.
like that, and that's who's hired to get on those service
You
productions.
mean in terms of the genre filmmaking being made in Canada, but by Americans, so Resident
By
Evil? and-
Resident Evil. Not that I didn't want to pick on Resident Evil.
No, fair
In some
enough.
ways, they do what they're supposed to do. So
that I wanted to mention is that what you're talking about and what he's mentioned is that the kind of cultural identifiers of being Canadian, I got that from everybody but Lysadek. Like, you ask me how rhymes got made, I made 10 short films convincing people that that what I'm trying to do would work. And even then, I almost feel like it was the Americans in Tribeca giving a nod to the screenplay that finally got the wheels moving. And
Well, approval by Americans is the magic bullet.
yeah,
Exactly.
it really is.
or Werner Herzog. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to make it clear that if somebody wrote an essay, which people have amazingly, about my films, and they claimed that they were very Canadian or very Jewish, I wouldn't argue with them.
It's just not
it's
your
just,
job
it's not
to
my
make
job.
them.
It just I don't think about it that way. And the only way, like I said, the only way I think about Canadian is I feel like if I bought the rights as for me in my house, I could get that film made.
And you know what? They're still teaching it in university. Maybe
That would take us back to the failure thing, though. I think in a way, because that book's unfilmable.
I'd like to open it up for questions or comments if there are any at this point. I see a hand up at the back there. And there's a mic coming down to you.
While we're waiting for the mic, can I
Yeah.
just throw in the whole thing about genre stuff?
Yeah.
We actually have a very lengthy history of doing genre.
Yeah.
Not just in the tax credit years. One of the best horror movies of the last 30 years is Ginger Snaps, and that's an excellent horror
No, and
movie.
It should be said too that guys like Scorsese and Spielberg are talking about going to school in California and mentioning the kind of documentaries coming out of the NFB as a huge influence. So there's definite we have a real rich history of cinema here.
But what I do think is that there's a mythology that's built around Canadian cinema. It's like often people will tell me, oh yeah, it must be Canadian, it's rural, and it's like about a Protestant minister growing up in the prairies or whatever, like living in the prairies. And in fact, that is untrue. Like the majority of the films that are made in Canada are urban films.
No, but there are films like Richard Ford writes the things. There's this one that takes place in the prairies with vampires. Those could be very Canadian. Films like that would feel very Canadian to me, but they'd never get made here. There are, prairie American films are way more violent than prairie Canadian films.
In the back?
Hi, my name's Alex. I'm from Fanshawe College in London, Ontario. Great to be here. My question for all three of you is, what do you classify as success? This is our last year as film students, and when you make it in the industry, how long did it take you to feel like you were doing something worthwhile and just your work, and what do you classify as success, pretty much?
That's a great question.
Well, I don't know if I should answer that. I told people this year that after I won the prize for Best Canadian Film, I unfortunately had to give up my self-image as a failure with a couple of successes. But so I was a failure till 48. So, but as soon as you have some success, nobody cares. That gets written off. Nobody wants to hear your failure story. So, Jeff, I'm jealous of Jeff and everybody on who ever made a feature film before they were.
I'm almost 40.
Oh,
I
okay.
just look pretty.
Okay.
No, I'm actually, like I said, I've made 10 short films, and I think success for me was just having people stop questioning my vision of what I was trying to do, and being able to kind of do it without, like before I did the colony, I was building houses and I was working up in the woods and I was doing, a lot of hard labor jobs. And once the colony hit, we got on the TIFF Top 10. It's the first time we made TIFF Top 10. And it was kind of a vindication of what I was trying to do. Whereas prior to that, there was so much resistance in terms of, oh, you can't show this because it depicts natives as being alcoholics. And I said, well, fuck, the guys I do know are alcoholics. What are you talking about? And then it became like the kind of arrogance there of funders that dictated to me, no, this isn't native, this is native. And it's like, well, which one of us grew up on a reserve? Which one of us speaks Mi'kmaq? I mean, like, who the hell are you to be telling me what native is? And I think after the colony, that stopped. And it still became it was still a bit of a struggle. I had done a couple of other screenplays that fortunately the CFC got a hold of, and they really liked them. And I've been fortunate enough to being able to write another one that got made. And I hear all these horror stories about funding, whereas that actually, the funding kind of fell into place fairly quickly. Everybody wanted to see that first feature of me because of the colony. So I think I was about 26 or something like when that hit. And I started getting my first taste of what press was like and the awards set and stuff like that. So I define success by being able to get to do what you do in this industry, because you're spending hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars, and it's pretty naive. If you guys are all, if there's a kind of group of student filmmakers out there, if you want hundreds of thousands of dollars of other people's money, you're going to have to deal with the idea that they're going to have opinions about what you want to do. And you're going to have to kind of navigate that as part of your job, and not sit there and like, oh, I'm an auteur and I have this vision and you can't fuck with it. I mean, that's nonsense.
Okay. You just made me realize why I failed.
But you're not a failure.
I do have a speech that I give to every young person who asks me about being a filmmaker, trying to dissuade them, but I'll do it in the hallway later. I won't do it here.
Other questions, comments? Right. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Hi. I have a few comments, and I also have a question. And one of my comments is that I think all of us as artists are outsiders. That I also grew up in Montreal, and I was big into punk rock and all the rest. And I think very few of us really, with stories to tell, are part of the mainstream. I think majority of us are outside because we feel that anger and that push to voice what we see as not being voiced. Yeah. Also, I also feel that telefilm puts a lot of hurdles in place to get funding, that you have to make films to make a film. And I was going to ask the panel, what do they think of with the advent of digital, we're no longer looking at millions of dollars, that we can do some guerrilla filmmaking, and you're seeing more and more of this different kind of film coming out of Canada because of our funding agencies. So I think that's pushing people to make film cooperatives and try to come up with a different model for filmmaking.
That's not 100% true, honestly. The idea that you're saving a little bit of money on processing and things like that when you're using digital, but at the end of the day, you're paying a digital wrangler who didn't exist before. So, yeah, you're still paying the actors. You're still dealing with unions. You're still dealing with all the things that were in place before. So we shot on digital, and it still cost $1.5 million. So yes, you do. If you want to get your films made, yes, you do.
Well, okay, so yes, there are people, and there's one person in the audience is a prime example, who make films for cheap, and those films are helping to, if you have to look at Canadian films and you look at all the films that are made for $50,000, those films are generally pushing way outside the boundaries of Canadian film. But at the same time, those people who are making those films are not, no matter how much success they're having at festivals and winning prizes and things like that, they are not being necessarily invited in to the funding agencies. Oh, you've proved yourself now making these films that we wouldn't have considered Canadian, and we wouldn't have funded that film, but we see now it's a really good film. So here's the $1.5 million, so you don't have to make your film for $50,000 anymore. That's not happening, or I don't see it happening.
There is a lot of guerrilla filmmaking in Canada. The other day at the TFCA, one of the films that was nominated was The Dirties, which I don't think was pretty much done, shot on video, done very independently, kind of a fake doc, kind of a faux doc kind of feel. So there is that, but I don't necessarily think that guerrilla filmmaking stuff and, involving digital video and like cheaper shoots, that's not just Canadian. I mean, that's international, right? That's an international phenomenon. And, there are ways to do that, but as Jeff said, it depends on where you want to go. If you're going to make, there are lots of filmmakers who have lengthy careers and do really interesting and strong work on low budgets, and that's an option. I think Ingrid Veninger's in the audience, and she's a major independent filmmaker.
But she's the one I'm thinking of who still is stuck there.
Well,
I mean, I don't know. Maybe not a nice word, but like, I don't know. You know what? It's like,
Well, the flip side is too, being good affords you a lot of freedom also, because I didn't we worked with the CFC, and they didn't try to direct my screenwriting any which way, and they gave me a ton of freedom, and like $1.5 million, that is low budget, that is super low budget, and I think like at some point you kind of need to understand that you are dealing with tons, like even $50,000, like you're tossing that number around. Oh, that's a low budget. I mean, that's $50,000, man. You can live off that for like 2 years. So that's not a lot. I mean, that's still a lot of money. And I think once you start dealing with that type of money, you have to kind of concede to the idea that you need to kind of get an audience. You need. That's kind of one of the problems with Canadian films, is that they make these movies, and it's okay if they don't make money. And I don't think that's true. If you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of dollars of somebody else's money, you have to make it back for them. Otherwise, you're being an irresponsible filmmaker.
Okay, but that, what? You're being, I don't know what the word is, but that is what's wrong with the Canadian film industry, that we don't have to make money. That is what's, that is why we have the industry we have, because we're not supposed to make money. And actually, I remember a few years ago when, it's a story, when Telefilm decided to have a policy of commercial films. And I said to somebody, oh, so I guess they're going to change the film officers. And then somebody just looked at me like, are you crazy? And I was like, oh.
We have another question in the back there.
You didn't get that joke.
Jim, Sheridan College. Other than the fact that you guys were born in Canada, what makes you Canadian?
Nothing.
Yeah,
Nothing.
I don't know.
I went to Sheridan, by the way.
I don't know. I think I think we're a little bit more socially conscious than let's say our neighbors to the west. And I think, put it to you this way, we're not having arguments about whether or not we should let guns into schools. We're not having arguments about whether or not gay people should be able to marry. I mean, not really anyway. There's still like a contingent of weirdos out there that really truly believe that, but I think that is something that, we've inherently kind of embraced as being the right of being a human being. A lot of these things don't necessarily apply to Native people, but I think that's a part of a foible that is part of being human, and I think it's a part of Canadian identity too. So I kind of harp on the idea that Native people are suppressed, but I don't even know if I'd have a career if we weren't. To be honest,
I mean, what, to me, I consider my films to be just like anybody else's films, just part of the world of filmmaking. The only level on which I relate to Canadian is that I do not want to be proud of being Canadian. I do not want pride, period. I just don't get it. But unfortunately, I have it. So it's like, oh, that's a good song. He's Canadian. Oh, and then I feel this pride, and then I feel like an idiot that I felt pride, but I feel that. So Jeff might not feel like he's part of Canada, but I'm proud of him that he's a Canadian filmmaker and that made a great film that people are liking. I can't help that. So I do feel that connection with him, and I feel that with all Canadians. But, it's about that deep because really, I feel like filmmakers are my community. I feel a connection with Jeff because he's a filmmaker. I feel like we inherently speak the same language. The fact that we have also another connection, that's nice, but that's about it.
I think what makes me proud to be Canadian is that it's a bit of a dichotomy because I live in a culture that suppresses me, but at the same time, they allow me to make a film like Rhymes or like The Colony that kind of points out the suppressor and says, "Why, you guys are such fucking assholes." And it's like, I'm using your tax money to say that.
We're masochists.
Yeah. So I kind of
officially masochists, actually.
When I accepted the award, that's kind of what I pointed out. Like, I'm very proud to be from a country that allows me to voice my opinion, that genuinely allows me to voice my opinion. And I make these films that are social protest films that are against kind of like the white establishment. And I'm allowed to make them and win awards for them. This would not happen in the U.S. As a matter of fact, if you look at the native film set in the U.S., they make these kind of propaganda positivity movies because no native filmmaker there is going to be allowed to make a kind of Trail of Tears movie. If they do, it's going to be a kind of sterile docudrama that you can kind of easily dismiss. Because if you look at the culture over there too, it's so ingrained in media, it's so ingrained in pop culture that it's so easy to look at something that is on television as a piece of fiction.
Well, the funny thing about that, you're pressured to make positive statements reminds me of my favorite joke about Canadian film. But it comes from the fact that, like, if you read Canadian film magazines, they're all just puff pieces. Nobody's criticized. There's no quality control. No, that's why everybody who makes a film is on the same level. You cannot be more talented or a better filmmaker than that person because everybody, if you made a film, that's it. You made a film, which leads to the joke, which is, what's the best thing anybody will say about a Canadian film? Pretty good. What's the worst thing they'll say? Pretty good. That is why we don't have, that is more about the Canadian culture because everything's equal.
Okay, we're starting to run out of time, but we're going to take one more final question right here.
Okay. Just continuing the conversation from before, I'm wondering whether any of the panelists see digital distribution as an opportunity for the Canadian industry to maybe reorient its focus, become potentially more commercial, and just compete on this, let's say, evolving platform more than we have maybe been able to or have tried to with our neighbors, with other emerging cinemas. I'm wondering whether you think that the impact of digital distribution will maybe...
Well, technically, it's all digital distribution because nobody uses, like repertory theaters maybe use films, but it's all DCPs now. Like, I'm sure this is a DCP projector. It's all digital cinema prints, so it's not...
You're talking about like online and Netflix and
I mean,
that kind of thing.
I mean, yeah.
My philosophy is like, keep your film offline as much as you can because once it's on there, you're never going to see money from it because it's now public property more or less. Regardless of whether or not it's still like under copyright, it's public property. So I don't think digital distribution, I don't personally think that would help. You still need to get asses in seats, in my opinion. I still think you need to get people to kind of come out and see your film. It needs to kind of almost be an event film. Like I personally want to turn I want to do as much as I can to turn Canadian cinema towards that kind of philosophy of, yes, we can make money as Canadians and we can get Canadians to come out and see our films, I think, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what there are people making money from that. I don't know how they're making money. There's lots of people wanting to do that aren't making money. I don't know. Jeff sort of struck at it. It's like, you know, the model in Canada is not about making money. It's government support, and government is supporting films mostly for an idea of a culture that they're promoting to Canadian, and that's why the things get made, and that's why they wonder, is that Canadian? Because broadcasters actually think, is this what we want to show to Canadians? Is this what we want to reflect back to Canadians? Like, I had a series once, and I told this story before, when the broadcaster said it was a sitcom, and she said it was too funny. But with the other thing she said was, are you making fun of people in small towns? And I'm like, yeah, I am. And then they said, well, because most of our audience in Canada lives in small towns. And I'm like, that's not true. Like, I don't know but what you're saying is, most of the audience in Canada is in urban, but they don't watch our station, right? Because you make stuff for people who live in small towns. So, yeah, if you're going in Canada to get money to make a thing, nobody's going to care whether it makes money or not. They're just going to care whether it sets the proper tone.
I'm just going to comment on the digital distribution, and you're right about DCP, but I do think it's meant sort of more internet distribution. And I think it was IndieWire article I was reading this morning, and they were saying that to get people to seek out the film, whether it be on Netflix or whatever pay-per-view option that they're looking at, it needs a theatrical release for it to have that profile, that word of mouth, that people will actually go and seek it out. Just putting it onto Netflix or whatever, people aren't going to know what it is. They're not going to find it. They're not going to go looking for it.
You're still in serious competition with everything that's out there, both stuff that's played theatrically and stuff that's only played on the web. I don't know of any, it was a web hit and that was it, right? Like, except for, cat videos on YouTube. But just to get to Alan's last comment, I do think there's an inherent real danger if you're not going to attempt to define yourself and you're not represented in your cinema. The country sort of fizzles away. If you're not reflected imaginably. No, I didn't think you were, but I just wanted to throw that in.
I don't hide it, but it just
that just opens up a whole other can of worms about nationalism. But
we're
gonna have to actually end it on that because we've run out of time. But thank you very much to all of you for making it out today, and also to our panelists. Thanks.